good evening from whichever part of the world that you're watching from, and a very warm welcome to this World Water Week's talk show, which is all about the power of community, and we'll be diving deeper on how human rights in water and nature can come together. Now, today's talk show is brought to you by Human Right to Water, IUCN, and ADB, and it's so lovely that you're tuning in with us here today. Whether that's here in the room with us in Stockholm or whether you're watching online, I think the presence of everyone here always underlines the importance of the topic. My name is Haja Yacoubi. I am a former United Nations Youth Representative for the Netherlands. But above all, I'm very delighted to be your moderator for these upcoming 20 minutes. And not the least of which because we'll be diving into a very, very important topic. We'll be talking more about how a human rights-based approach can connect the right to a clean, safe and healthy living environment to the right that we also have to water and sanitation. Now, we'll be talking about some case studies from various regions and also how important the involvement of local communities is in that pursuit. So enough to dive into in 20 short minutes. I'm very delighted to right away go over to the stellar panel that we have in our midst today. A very warm welcome to you. First of all, a very warm welcome to Amanda Loofen, who is the CEO of Human Right to Water. Good to have you here with us.
Thank you, Haja.
Then also a very warm welcome to Tanja Huizer, who is a Senior Water Resilience Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. Tanja, also so lovely to have you here. And last but not least, we are also joined by Alejandro Isa, who is the Director of the Environmental Law Center at IUCN. Very good to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
Hey, so there's a lot that we're going to discuss in 20 minutes, but before we do, I wanted to start with you, Amanda, because, you've decided, the three of you have decided to bring this topic to the stage here in Stockholm during the World Water Week. What sort of prompted that? What's the relevancy and urgency here?
Well, you can't separate those two topics, actually. And if you want to have a water resource with good quality and the quantity that we need for long-term supply, then you actually really need to think about where the water's coming from. And drinking water needs a steady supply of fresh water, whether it could be recycled water, or it could be treated, or it could be straight from the ground. But you need to think about where it's going to come from. Yeah. And it's quite short-sighted if you don't protect the source of the water that you need. Yeah. And if you think about toilet effluent, it ends up in the water systems if you're not careful, either through groundwater or it could end up in fresh water, causing pollution. Mm-hmm. So there's a cycle between the way we need water for drinking, the way we dispose of water that can or through our toilets and other systems that ends up in pollution. And then we need to think about the whole water cycle. And in many places it's at stretch point. Yeah. So in order to sustain life of every kind, we need to look after our water resources, whether it's lakes, systems or river systems. Yeah. And I think of biodiversity as the canary in the mine shaft, as it were. Okay. So if you protect your ecosystems and you have biodiversity and you have the animals living in the aquatic systems, then you know that your water is healthy and clean and you're protecting your water bodies.
Right, and that's also the synergy you then see between the two, right? Water and nature in that respect.
Yes, so if you protect nature, you have a long-term source of water resources for drinking water in the long term.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much. Alejandro, if I can go to you. You work for one of the largest organizations that cares for biodiversity, conservation, nature protection. I don't know if this is a false dichotomy, but it's almost always when we talk about these sorts of things that we ask the question, what in essence comes first? Is it people? Is it the environment? And I'm particularly interested to hear from you from like a legal point of view. How do you sort of look at that sort of fundamental argument?
Well, I think there is no one or the other. I think we have to understand that we are part of nature. The moment in which we understand that nature is not an externality, that we are part of that. Yeah. So there is no one or the other, what comes first. So human beings depend on nature. Yeah. Nature is, as Amanda has said, for survival, fundamental, for us to have water, to have clean environment, to have natural resources, and not, something that is external to us. We are inextricably linked to nature, and nature depends on us also, from a legal point of view, for us human beings to set the rules of the game,
Yeah.
so to say, how do we conserve, how do we protect,
Right.
and the law will have to establish certain norms and certain rules. What happens when you don't do that?
Yeah, I love that. I was riding along when you said nature is not an externality. I think that really speaks to the core of it, right? It's almost this sort of distinction that we often make when we say you can have an egocentric approach where you place the human outside of sort of the totality of nature, above it, on top of it, and then you have an ecocentric approach where you acknowledge indeed that it's a fundamental part of it. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Tanya, if I can go to you. You have mentioned earlier that your passion is making a difference for people. I really loved reading that, and from that perspective, I was very curious from like a human rights-based approach. How do you think that the principle of participation and sort of including community voices, enhancing those, has played a role in the water infrastructure projects that ADB has?
Well, ecosystem approach, or maybe human-centric design approach. That's what we really like to see. What I experienced myself in our project is when we involve communities from the start, it's a real game changer. So it's not only about infrastructure, but it's also about ownership of this infrastructure, and making sure it will be future-proof. And when you involve communities from the start, you really get a good idea on their needs. We as ADB, our project teams, but of course also the government and the decision makers. So we really try to include that in our designs of the projects and the investments that we do. And I mean, we have many tools for that, because involving people is not just by having meetings. You really need to listen. You need to listen to all groups, to all voices, not only the loudest.
Do you have any success stories with regards to that? Or
Actually, we have many. Also collected recently together with Amanda of Human Right to Water. But one of them is in Cambodia. It's a project where we brought together a new design modern pipe system with traditional wells on request of the communities, because they wanted to keep their wells. So we just improved them a little bit with their support. And when the result of that is that they own the whole water system now, and they have also trained community members who support with operation and maintenance. So it's really future-proof as well.
Truly sustainable in a way, because you're able to upkeep it for the long run also.
Exactly.
So I mean, that's an amazing example of what a community-based approach can do. I mean, Amanda, if I would go to you and if I would sort of ask from that same point of view, all the work that you do on and your organization does on protecting human rights, how does a community-based approach come into play there?
Well, first of all, the human right to a healthy environment was only recognized a couple of years ago, which was really interesting. It was a lot of hard work from a lot of people. But actually the principles of the human rights to a safe, clean and healthy environment and the principles of the right to water are the same. They're very much about meaningful engagement and participation in projects. So it covers so that ability to engage meaningfully in the environment and in water infrastructure projects is really important. We have a lot of easy steps that we can take. And I noticed that projects often have a gender policy or an indigenous people policy, but it's not enough. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily engaging meaningfully so that those people feel comfortable to contribute to the solution.
And when you say meaningfully, could you elaborate a little bit on what that could look like?
Well, having women in the room isn't enough. You actually need to enable them to feel comfortable to participate. So they need to feel that they can speak up and that their voices are going to be heard. And that often requires a lot more effort than you think to enable that to happen. And quite honestly, if we're going to achieve SDG 6, we really need to be thinking a little bit more carefully about how we get people involved in finding the solutions, and the vulnerable groups are the ones that don't normally speak up.
It sort of also is based on this entire premise of equity, right? Giving people also adequate resources to overcome the gaps that are already existing, even when you indeed include them, that usually doesn't suffice in that way. Thank you so much for sharing. Alejandra, I want to go to you because, of course, we're talking about human rights, and I think this is like I hope you're going to say yes to this. That's why I'm very curious to hear your
Let's
answer.
see.
But do you indeed no pressure? Do you really think that human rights help to sort of also promote nature conservation? Because that's also, of course, why everybody in the field is working as hard as they do, because they believe that it is efficient. But again, no pressure. But I'm curious to hear your outlook on that.
No, but I will say yes. The moment in which we recognize that for human rights to be effective, you need a living ecosystem, you need nature to be all right,
Right.
then it's natural
Yeah.
that you will conserve nature for
Yeah.
the sake of fulfilling human rights. So for me, this is the fundamental relationship that we need to understand,
Yeah.
which falls from what I said before. The moment in which we recognize that nature is not an externality, that we are part of that.
Yeah,
We
exactly.
realize that we need nature for us to survive, and therefore, for realizing the human rights, we protect nature. And that's
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's an indispensable, let's say, element of fulfilling human rights.
Right.
You need a living ecosystem, you need
Yeah.
clean water, you need clean air, and then you will do that. You will
Exactly.
fulfill your rights
Yeah.
as a human being.
Yeah, I am so happy you said yes, but even happier with that answer, because it's indeed, I mean, nature will go on fine without us, but we won't without nature. So indeed, it is
Completely.
part of
Absolutely.
it. Tanya, I wanted to ask you this next thing, because I mean, from ADB's sort of point of view, and I think not just ADB, but many people that are working when we talk about policy changes, strategies that we put into place. Sometimes there's also the risk when we talk about a human rights based approach and we work out plans for it, that it can remain a paper tiger, so to say.
Yeah.
So just policy on paper. How do you sort of make sure, and how does ADB make sure that it doesn't just stick to that, but that it also translates to executive actions from the day to day that actually happen?
Well, first of all, I think we're really proud that we now collected cases that ADB worked on with good examples.
Yeah.
So we don't like to share the theory, but we really want to showcase how you can do it to policymakers.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think for ADB, it's not only about knowledge sharing and sharing of examples. I think we should really do it more in our project. We concluded actually that ADB is already doing quite a lot in the projects with indeed the gender guidelines and so on.
Yeah.
But we can also learn from the human right-based approach and
Yeah.
the relation with the nature and environment
Yeah.
on how we can do that better.
Yeah.
So that is actually one of the things that we as ADB are aiming to do.
Yeah.
Having internal sessions also with the team of Amanda and so
Yeah.
on to see what steps can we make to create more awareness in our
Right.
ADB staff, as
Yeah.
well as, of course, the countries where we work in.
Yeah.
And we will do that with online sessions.
Yeah.
We will have an Asia Pacific Water Resilience Hub in which we also publish a lot of like this
The work that you
publication, but also online lectures and so on.
Yeah.
So I think we're really trying to take steps to share it.
That's
Yeah.
good. And I mean, in a way, working together with partners, it helps, bring in input, but it also helps to sort of keep each other accountable, because you're sort of making sure that everybody plays their part, contributes their fair share. Amanda, if I can go to you, I'd love to get into some specificness. So when we talk about, involving local voices, a community-based approach, human rights-based approach, do you have any examples where either women or indigenous people or other marginalized groups were sort of, included in a project, and you can so fundamentally see the value that has brought?
Well, we have a lot of examples in the publications we've just released. We have one in each of the regions, and you can see on the screen the link to the Asia Pacific publication that we've just released. We've launched them all this week.
Yeah.
Effectively, what we're doing is linking legislation in those countries with how case studies can demonstrate those human rights-based approaches in practice.
Yeah.
And it's been a really fascinating process.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is that the projects themselves often report on performance and how well they've done in terms of providing water for people, but they don't necessarily report on the processes. And it's quite difficult sometimes to find out how well they have performed in terms of being human rights based. So that was one of the learnings for us, that there needs to be more transparency about the actual process itself.
Right.
So in Latin America, to give another example, we discovered that there was a number of storytelling publications that picked out women in the community that were involved in the project and how they'd become leaders as a result of the engagement. And that was really helpful to me to understand how the process worked. So there were cases, for example, in Colombia or Peru, where women were invited into the local water service authority. They were given leadership positions. And the reason it worked so well was because they were part of the community as well. So that it was a two-way communication. They were able to not only take the learnings to the community about hygiene and the importance of clean drinking water, but also into the project design, talking about which vulnerable groups, what their needs were, and how the project could be designed better.
Yeah.
And then earlier this week at our launch, actually, we invited an indigenous woman from the Wayu community in Colombia to speak about how they educated children in their community about this change in thinking for them about using toilets and cleaning water. And they really had to work with in a creative way with puppets to make it a good story.
To make it work. That's so
It was
interesting.
really
to
fun.
hear.
We all learned a lot about that.
For sure, and thanks for giving those examples. And I mean, it's also good to hear the process behind it. So, say, Tanya, if I could ask you about the same publication, how do you think it will help government officials to sort of, integrate human rights principles into, water project development and other sort of policy implications that might have?
Yeah, well, like I said, it's not a theoretical report. It's really what we did together with Amanda and her team is to analyze the different policies and legislation in certain cases, certain countries.
Yeah.
And we connected the principles of the human rights-based approach with our case studies. So for each of the principles, like public participation, access to information, etc., we come up with some examples.
Yeah.
And we really hope to inspire policymakers by these examples so that they can consider how they can either change their policies or regulations, include it in there, or just take steps in the projects that they do.
To the way forward. This is amazing to see, and I mean, we all know how imperative it is, right, that we make work of this. People can also check out this report by scanning the QR code. We'll display that again at the end. But in the meantime, if I think about looking forward, there are a lot of trends that could hopefully lead to some first steps of optimism, even though that we also know that the situation is dire and the urgency is big. But one of those other trends that I actually wanted to tap into, and I wanted to ask you about it, Alejandro, is, we see this sort of growing worldwide recognition when it comes to rights to nature. And I wanted to ask you, how would you sort of say does that in your perspective relate to a human right to water? Is it contradictory to give both rights to people and nature? I mean, from a legal perspective, I'm quite interested to hear more about that.
It's a super good question, and we can speak here for hours about that.
Yeah.
And some of my colleagues, lawyers, will say, what I'm going to say, Alejandro, you are a bit crazy with that. I will say, if we understand that we and nature are interlinked,
Right.
granting rights to nature will inevitably contribute to the realization of human rights.
Yeah.
In other words, the moment in which you recognize a living entity like nature, like an animal, like an ecosystem, to have its own rights, you correlate that to the human rights to nature.
Right.
In other words, we can fulfill our rights by way of recognizing the rights of nature.
Yeah.
Right? So there is a correlation between the two of them. It helps to break that feeling, anthropocentric versus ecocentric, and we all have rights that are interdependent.
Yeah.
Therefore, one helps the other to be
Yeah.
fulfilled. And it gives human rights an extra layer of protection, in my view. So it's very complementary, and I will say so, so in as much as it might be a bit crazy, a bit complicated to be implemented from a legal point of view, I think it contributes fully to the realization of human rights.
That's amazing. And that's one red thread I've heard throughout this entire talk show is at the very core, on a very deep level, it's about this realization how much of a whole everything is, and that we have a lot of sort of false, barriers to create the illusion of separateness.
Absolutely.
As we are about to end the talk show, I have one final question that I want to ask you, Amanda. Everybody that's here with us in Stockholm, but also the people watching this later, watching online, what do you hope is the main message that they take away from this?
I think that Well, the main message is that we need to make more effort to be human rights based. It's not easy, and it's the process that counts.
Right.
The only way we're going to reach the vulnerable groups that don't have access to water or the healthy environment, whichever human right we're looking at, is to listen to what people need.
Yeah. And making effort is something
Yeah.
that we can all do. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for sharing all your insights, your expertise. To everybody here, thank you for being with us. And to all those watching from home, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much. Thanks. Sorry.